This UCSD TV program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest programs.
Emile is somebody who has traveled all over the world, and these trips all over the world, together with experiences that he faced that left him baffled, are the energy or the nurturing elements to feed that scientific curiosity that has led him to bring together biology with conflict resolution. And one experience, there are many, and I'm sure he'll talk about some of them, is when he was in Ireland. And in his experience, he spent weeks working at a summer camp that brought together Catholic children with children who were Protestant. And Emile, together with all the other counselors, were like super happy. Oh my God, they're all together and they get along. What are these people saying? Peace is easy to achieve. And as they're like sort of ending the summer really delighted, all of a sudden, two kids begin a fight. A Catholic kid and a Protestant kid. And guess what happened? All of a sudden, 150 kids are beating each other up. Where did the empathy go? What happened to the friendship that he had witnessed over weeks? So that's a question that he kept with him as he went to other places. For example, when he spent time in South Africa during the transition from apartheid to democracy, or when he visited Sri Lanka during one of the largest Tamil tiger strikes in the nation's history, or working in Israel and Palestine around the Second Intifada, and visiting many, many other countries plagued with ongoing and unresolved conflicts. All this has shaped a fascinating research agenda on the empathy gap, which we're going to listen to what that means, and testing assumptions about what programs work or what components of some programs work. It is a research agenda with a clear end goal: to provide support to conflict resolution programs, to help us understand what works and what doesn't work, what we can do better to create a better world. In a minute, you will understand why I was taking pictures and tweeting like a maniac with excitement in the middle of the conference at the AFP to make sure that we could share all of this with you today, USD and Tijuana community. So with this in mind, let's welcome Emile Bruneau to the podium.
Well, thank you for that really wonderful introduction. It's really a delight and an honor to be here. I'm particularly fond of talking to audiences that are involved with their boots on the ground, who are really trying to do the hard and difficult work of peace building. And part of the reason for that is that, as was mentioned, I had my own small experience with this a number of years ago, and my research program I think of as trying to provide information to that young 25-year-old that would help him in that situation. So in a way, I feel like I get to give this lecture to myself 15 years ago. So one note about the talk tonight, I'm going to fill you at the beginning with a healthy dose of despair, but I promise that I will turn it around with hope and optimism at the end. So fear not. So this research program that I've embarked on indeed was inspired by my experiences overseas before I was a scientist, but while I was scientifically minded. So one thing that really struck me about these experiences, being in these conflict regions during these times of conflict, was that despite the unbelievable differences between these conflicts, so you can see they're spread across 3 continents, they all involve completely different religions, different languages, different histories, different racial groups. What really struck me was how similar, how eerily similar they were. And I think this is captured really nicely by a quote by Anwar Sadat. He said in this speech to the Israeli Knesset, he said, "Yet there remains another wall, not just the physical barrier between them. This wall constitutes the psychological barrier between us, a barrier of suspicion, of rejection, of fear, of deception, a barrier of distorted and eroded interpretation of every event and statement." And I think what this is capturing is this profound barrier that exists in the minds of people who are in conflict. And Sadat said that this was responsible, in his mind, to 70% of the barrier between the people. And what I think is particularly astute about Sadat's observation is that he includes what we might think of as affective processes that are more emotional, but also he talks about distorted and eroded interpretation, very cognitive processes, like high-level reasoning. And I think both of these are really important and involved in intergroup conflict. So a fundamental problem that we face, that we're working on, is how do we surmount these psychological barriers? And I had my part in trying to do this in this program, and indeed, it was really striking to me, the capstone of the program, this brawl between all the children, because I, of course, came away from this program wondering what on earth we had just done. Had we done more harm than good? And I came back to the States with a number of questions. What are the best practices? Are there other things we could have done that we didn't do? Are there things we did that we shouldn't have done? So in general, what works and what doesn't, and for whom? And I realized that there weren't a whole lot of questions there weren't a whole lot of answers out there, but I actually have a suspicion now from what I know about neuroscience, that this program might not be alone. In fact, there are dozens and dozens of dialogue programs and conflict resolution programs. And my fear is that more often than we would hope, these programs not only fail, but they might backfire, just like the one I experienced. And there is a reason to think this is so. We have common sense intuitions about what works, especially what works with other people. And we base our programs on common sense, and of course we have to do this. What else do we have to go on? But there are reasons to believe that our common sense may backfire. That we are psychologically set up ourselves to implement programs that might have negative effects. And my favorite example of this is not a conflict resolution program, but this is a behavioral intervention nonetheless. So this is a story that happens in the Petrified Forest National Park. One day, a social psychologist was visiting the Petrified Forest, and they saw this sign there. Your heritage is being vandalized every day by theft losses of petrified wood of 14 tons a year, mostly a small piece at a time. Now, of course, this was put up. This is a common sense intervention. You shock people with this statistic. You appeal to their morality, and you get them to stop stealing the petrified wood. Well, the person who was visiting, this social psychologist, was actually appalled to see this sign. And the reason is that we know from psychology research and now neuroscience research that our behavior is really strongly influenced by what we call descriptive norms. That is, if we are told that everybody else is doing it, we tend to follow suit. And there's reason to think that this makes a lot of sense, why this would be evolved into us. If you're on the Serengeti and you see all the people in your group drinking from water hole A and not water hole B, drink from water hole A, right? You might get eaten if you go to the other one, or you might get dysentery, right? You want to follow your group. If they all start running in the other direction, you don't really want to think, I wonder why they're running. Maybe I should go that way instead, right? Those people would probably be weeded out of the gene pool pretty quickly. So, of course, there's strong reason for us to follow what other people do, and that this should be a deeply implicit automatic process. So, but this social psychologist wasn't satisfied with just that reasoning. They wanted to actually test this empirically. So what they did is they got the National Forest to agree to allow them to rotate through different signs in the park. And these poor graduate students went and individually marked tiny little pieces of petrified wood so they could figure out how many of these pieces were stolen during each of these information campaigns. So there was a baseline campaign with no sign there, and then there was one that had no norm that just said, please don't remove wood from the petrified forest. They don't tell you what anybody else is doing. And then one that includes a social norm. Many past visitors have done this, please don't do it. So here are the data. For the baseline condition, about 3% of the pieces of petrified wood were stolen in the amount of time they had the sign up. When they put up the sign that basically just said, look, don't steal, it actually decreased behavior quite nicely. When they put up the sign that said, don't steal, everybody's doing it, it actually almost tripled the behavior. Right? And this is crazy how big this effect is, and it's been replicated all over the place, including in the Channel Islands, where they have the smooth little rocks there. Right? They did the same experiment, got the same answers. This is an incredibly robust effect. We can observe it all over the place, and yet you see it where now that you're cued into it, you're going to see it all over the place. For example, here is an anti-littering campaign from California. A number of years ago. Did you know that cigarette butts are the most commonly littered item? So this is showing you that everybody's doing it, explicitly telling you that everybody's doing it, and asking you not to do it. So this is the type of intervention we would predict would actually dramatically increase the behavior we're trying to decrease. And more tragically, here is a paraphrase of a US military pamphlet drop over Somalia. In Somalia, over 60% of the young males are involved in piracy. Everybody's doing it. Help us to keep your young boys safe by steering them away from this activity. Right, so this is happening all over the place, and there's a reason now, as a neuroscientist, why this has such great appeal. And it has to do with how the human brain is designed and how it works. So my favorite analogy for how the human brain works is actually borrowed from Buddhism. The analogy is that the human brain is like a rider sitting on top of an elephant. And the rider represents that part of your brain that you're consciously aware of, that you can introspect about. The elephant, on the other hand, represents the majority of your brain that you have no introspective access to. It is still responding to the environment and guiding your behavior, but you're not necessarily aware of what it's doing. You don't have to condone its behavior. It still does it. Okay, so it's great to hear this, but I'm a former teacher, and I always like to demonstrate things when I can. Sometimes they fail, they crash and burn, but it's worth the risk. So I'm going to pick on a student. Is there a student who's willing to come up here? Thank you. Come on down. Okay, so Michaela, stand right over here. I think this should be, you're going to be facing that bucket there. So your goal is just going to be to throw underhand and throw this little beanbag into the bucket.
Okay, can I go?
Yeah, go ahead. Okay, great. We'll give you a few shots. Okay. Okay, let me give you something to help you out here. So you're going to don these goggles.
Okay.
And here you go. And on the count of 3, I want you to throw. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so go ahead and keep the goggles on.
Okay.
Turn around and face the audience. If you look at her eyes, Michaela, right? Mm-hmm. Michaela's eyes, you might notice something is a little bit odd. And what I've done is actually pasted Fresnel prisms on the inside of the goggles that shift her visual field 20 degrees. So she actually threw exactly to where she sees the bucket. Okay? Okay, go ahead and take the goggles off. And on the count of 3, go ahead and throw at the bucket.
No.
Ready? 1, 2, 3. Okay, try it again. 1, 2, 3. You'll recover, I promise. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so what Michaela just wonderfully demonstrated is a process called Prism Adaptation. So I put these goggles on her. At first, her visual field was shifted so far, but her brain automatically adjusted to what she saw. In fact, it automatically adjusted, we know, because at the end, when we took the goggles off of her and her rider on her elephant was saying, throw the damn thing in the bucket, she was still missing. So it was the elephant that was still guiding her behavior, even though she didn't condone its behavior, even though she didn't want it to be doing that, it still was guiding it. So this is a demonstration of how we have multiple learning systems in our brain, and we might be completely unaware of one. In fact, we are. Okay, so what does this have to do with the norms? Well, So we had this intended effect, right, a moral appeal, but that moral appeal was directed at the rider on the elephant. There was an unintended consequence, which was it was appealing to a norm, and it was the norm that won out, right? So it actually increased the behavior we were trying to decrease. We actually know a fair amount about where this is encoded in the brain, too. So we know that there is a region called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but if I cut my head straight in half this way, it would be the region right between my eyes, right behind the forehead. So the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is a region that codes for someone's subjective value of something. If you really like wine and you drink a nice wine, you get activity in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. If you really like nice cars and you see a nice car, you get activity there. So it's coded to the individual's subjective value of something. So you get activity in the VMPFC if you think that other people like it. There are other things that work this way. So this is an unintentional priming norm. There's another process that the elephant is particularly susceptible to, and that is threat. So you could imagine an intended, again, a message where you're trying to appeal to someone's rational self-interest, but this message also might include some kind of threat prime in it as well. And the one that I spotted recently was this wonderful intuitive intervention developed by the World Bank to try to get Hungarians to integrate the Roma minority population into their society. And this is how their intervention goes. They show people the demographic curve of majority Hungarian regions. So Magyar is the term for ethnic majority Hungarian. So in Budapest, you have this demographic curve, right? Just like the baby boomers who are growing up. And this is a problem, right? Because as that group ages, they put more and more stress on healthcare system, and you have fewer and fewer people working in the economy. This is a problem that many developed countries face. You're having too few children for the aging population. Well, so the World Bank wants to get the ethnic majority Hungarians to integrate the Roma, and their argument is, well, look at the demographic curve of the Roma. It's more like a pyramid. So there are all these young Roma here who could be your future workforce if you integrate them and educate them, or they could be your future welfare recipients, right? So it's an appeal to their economic self-interest, but the problem with this is it also is a demographic threat to ethnic majority Hungarians, right? It's saying that your population is getting smaller and the Roma population is getting bigger and might overwhelm you over time. So my fear is that this has an intended intervention might have, again, an unintended consequence, which is a demographic threat. And we know that people respond to threats by becoming more xenophobic. So the fear is that this type of intervention, again, might backfire for reasons that we're quite aware of. And here, again, we know the neural systems behind threat and fear perceptions, and that is these little nodules deep in the middle of the brain, the amygdala, which responds very strongly to threat and fear. There's a specific type of threat that is particularly interesting in intergroup contexts, and that is stereotype threat. This was a phenomenon that was first described by Claude Steele a number of years ago. And it goes something like this. If you have a bunch of people in a room like this, and you hand out some very difficult math problems, and you have everybody fill out these math problems under time pressure, what you find is if you hand it out and say, okay, these are a series of games that you're doing, you find that the men and the women perform equally well on this task. But if you gave the same exact task, but just preceded it by saying, this is a task that's actually diagnostic of your mathematical abilities, all of a sudden now the women perform much less well on this test. This is about 40 points on the SAT that the women suffer in this condition. And this happens in many different ways. Of course, the reason here is that there's a stereotype that women aren't as good at math as men. And so if you're put in that situation where that stereotype is in mind, it erodes your ability to actually perform. So this is a threat, and your amygdala is very good at responding to threats, and it's very bad at doing SAT math problems. So if you're using that part of your brain, you're not doing as well. And this is incredibly flexible. If the women in the study are actually Asian women, if you have them report on the first page of the test their ethnic identity as Asian, and you do the same thing, diagnostic test, they outperform the men. right? The men are the one now who are under the stereotype threat. But if you ask them to report their gender instead, then you get this effect. The men outperform the women. So this is a really pervasive effect. It happens with athletic performance, with black and white athletes. If you have them do a task and you tell them it's diagnostic of their natural athletic ability, the black athletes outperform the white athletes. But if you tell them it's diagnostic of your strategic thinking in athletic situations, the white athletes outperform the black athletes on the same exact task. So this is a really powerful phenomenon that again, can be really prominent in intergroup situations. Okay, so there are some intuitive interventions that can backfire, right? They can activate ironic norms. You can prime threat. I think one lesson from this is that we have to accept the possibility that our intuitive interventions, our best intentions can backfire. They can have unintended consequences. And one take home from this is, of course, try to evaluate everything you do. Now, a little more doom and gloom. We want to evaluate, but it's very important to evaluate in the right way. There are also problems with common sense evaluations. So here is a cautionary tale on defining success in an intervention. So this is a diagram demonstrating the lobotomy, which was actually a really common medical procedure about 50 years ago. In fact, the person who developed the lobotomy was not only not ostracized, but they were awarded the Nobel Prize in medicine for developing the procedure. So at this time, it was considered an incredible success. And I think it's indisputable that it was an incredible success if you use this metric of success, right? So note that in the lobotomy, so this is, you stick in basically a modified ice pick right above the eye socket, and then you wiggle it back and forth to disconnect all of the connections between the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the region where you code subjective value of things in the world, and the rest of your brain. So yes, it does decrease violent outbursts. The problem is it decreases just about everything else, right? That there's less motivation to live, incontinence issues, so everything is completely disrupted when you do this often. So the problem here is not that it wasn't successful, it's that they were using the wrong metric of success, to my mind. And of course, this was done, well, I guess I just show you here, this is, it was done with a number of prominent people. This is Rosemary Kennedy, right, the sister of JFK. Okay, so it's important to evaluate, but it's really important to do it with the right measures. So here are the intuitive measures I think we all kind of point to when we think of the types of things that we should be changing in conflict resolution programs. Trust, empathy, dehumanization. I think if you looked at the website of a lot of peace-building programs, you would probably see these words pretty prominently displayed. I don't dispute that these are really important, but I want to give you a little bit of nuance from the research that we've done so far on these processes that shows that they're not quite as straightforward as we might think. First, with trust. This is one of my favorite studies that demonstrates something that I've observed before, and I'd be curious to see if you've had similar observations. So this was an experimental paradigm run in Israel. These are all Israelis. What they did is they brought a bunch of Israelis into the lab, and then they split them into two different groups. And they gave one of the groups more power than the other. So one of the groups was responsible for like taking notes and kind of giving the things to the other group. So they're experimentally empowered and disempowered, and then they basically bring them through a peace-building type exercise. And at the very end, they give the empowered group a bunch of tokens. And they say, okay, you need to now distribute the tokens between empowered and disempowered group. And they ask the disempowered group, okay, after engaging this activity, how many tokens do you think you will get? And so what they were looking at is the number of tokens that the experimentally disempowered group expected to receive, and then how much they actually received. And what happened was they had this elevated sense. They thought they were going to get more from the people they had just interacted with than they actually did. And here's my concern, is that this right here might represent not only disappointment, but since you've artificially elevated the trust towards the empowered group, this might be something more like betrayal. And of course, you can't have betrayal without trust. So building trust is great, but it comes with great consequences if you break that trust, because I feel like betrayal is a strong motivator of negative intergroup outcomes. Anybody who's read Shakespeare certainly knows that. So the fear is that this might explain some of the boomerang effect, or the rebound effect that some of you all might have observed. And the way I've observed it is talking mostly to Palestinian youth. So what I've found is that a lot of Palestinians who go through dialogue programs with Israelis, about 6 months after the program, have a lot of hostility towards Israel and Israelis. And I think the reason is, and kind of probing their thoughts on this, the reason seems to be that if the program's successful, it has not only increased trust towards the Israelis they were involved in the program with, but has expanded that to Israelis in general, right? That's usually the goal of these programs. But when they get back to the West Bank and they go through their first checkpoint with now an elevated feeling of trust towards Israelis, and they experience the same exact thing they have before, now it's not only a disappointment, now it's not only an inconvenience, but now it's a sense of betrayal. So my fear is that we worry so much on building trust as an end in and of itself that we don't worry about kind of keeping the trust going once the program is over. So I think trust can be problematic. Okay, but certainly empathy. Who could argue with empathy? So in interpersonal contexts, empathic concern, one of these definitions of empathy that is you feel a concern for the other person. This has been shown to motivate people in many different ways towards helping others. So both how you feel in the moment, how much empathic concern you feel for that individual predicts how willing you are to help them, and also how you self-report as an empathic person. So how much empathic concern you report having yourself. Both of those predict positive outcomes. So in interpersonal contexts, it seems to be pretty straightforward. The more empathic concern you have, the more likely you are to help other people. But I think in intergroup contexts, it gets much more complicated. So here's an example of this. So if empathic concern is the key in intergroup contexts, this would make sense, right? We see this all the time in the movies. This is the favorite model of Hollywood, that Muslim terrorists are terrorists because they lack empathy, right? They're sociopaths. But I think this view has to be reconciled with what we know about people who actually commit violence. So this is Wafa Idris. She was a volunteer paramedic. She's Palestinian. She helped families with their children when they were sick. She was a volunteer in her community her whole life. She was also the first Palestinian woman suicide bomber. And this is not an unusual tale. For people who have gone and talked to people who have tried to commit political violence, so a suicide bomber whose jacket didn't explode or who were thwarted in the process, when they've tried to characterize what these people are like, if anything, it seems like they're empathic. They're very caring people. The problem, I think, is that their empathy is not equally distributed. Their empathy is very strong for their own group and very weak for the other group. So to me, what might predict political violence is not low overall empathy, it's a gap in empathy between in-group and out-group. That is, your empathy for your in-group might motivate you to harm the other group because you feel the suffering of your people. And low empathy for the other group lowers that barrier to harming them. So if you have a big gap between these two, that's the kind of recipe for political disaster. So I've tested this experimentally just by having Americans try this out. So I got a bunch of American participants online to complete this task where they were just, they thought they were competing in a game with a bunch of other Americans and a bunch of people who spoke Arabic. And they read a bunch of these little stories about the people that they were competing with. So like this one, Nasser was made the butt of a joke by someone important. So, and Nasser is from Kuwait. And they just had to report how good and how bad this made them feel. So our measure of empathy was how bad does this make you feel that this bad thing happened to them? And we did the same thing. We showed them a bunch of stories, some about Americans and some about Arabs. And at the end, we gave them the opportunity to do a bunch of these boring, time-consuming problems for charity. And specifically, it was for an Arab charity. So the more of these problems they did, the more we would donate to the Arab Red Crescent Society. So the question was, they reported their trait empathic concern. My prediction was that their trait empathic concern, how empathic they said they were as people, would not predict how much they would donate to an out-group charity. And this indeed was the case. There was zero correlation. The people who were more empathic, they were no more likely to be altruistic towards the other group. Rather, I thought it would be the difference between these, what I call parochial empathy, the gap in empathy between in-group and out-group. And indeed, this did predict. So the people who had the larger gap in empathy between in-group and out-group were less likely to engage in this altruism. I did this 2 separate times, and I also wanted to see if this was indeed the case, that it was in-group empathy pushing them one way and out-group empathy pushing them the other. So what I'll show you here is just what we often do, which is a regression. That is, you include both of these variables at the same time and see how well they predict these behaviors. So in this case, this is willingness of Americans to loosen immigration restrictions of Arabs coming into the US, and also their willingness to actually donate to civilian victims of drone strikes. So the question was, will in-group empathy predict one way, and will out-group empathy predict the other? I'll show you these scores. These are between 0 and 1. So indeed, in-group empathy predicted in the opposite direction from out-group empathy, but they were both significantly predicting. So both of these are driving this behavior. The P, for those of you who aren't scientifically minded, the P just tells you how likely that is that these data are just due to chance. And you can see it's very, very unlikely. And the same was true for their actual donations. So the key here is not that empathy isn't important, but it's very important to get the right kind of empathy. If you are fostering empathy in people and you get more empathy in them towards their own group suffering, you might actually make things worse. That might motivate them to harm the other group rather than help the other group. If instead you're increasing their overall empathic concern towards the world, that actually has no correlation with how they behave towards the outgroup themselves. Instead, it's very important to look at this gap in empathy between in-group and outgroup. And finally, dehumanization. So dehumanization has strong historical roots. We see dehumanization of other groups all over the place. This is depictions of the Irish by the English during the colonization of Ireland. Depictions of Jewish people by the Germans during the Holocaust, and depictions of our enemies as brutes and savages and insects during the World Wars. So this is a part of human history. We see it all over, and it's not just coincidental. There's really strong theoretical work suggesting that the reason why we dehumanize other groups is that it disengages us from moral concern towards them. So we as humans, in order to get along in these harmonious societies, we have a bunch of moral rules that prevent us from harming others. But it's specifically related to other humans. If we remove that status of human, now all of the moral restrictions on harming them are off the table. So the idea is that this might allow moral harm. So there are a number of ways that scientists have measured dehumanization over the years. One of the most clever, I think, is infrahumanization. So the assumption here is that blatant dehumanization is a thing of the past, but it still might echo today in our everyday. And we might be able to capture this if we study it in subtle enough ways. So the idea of infrahumanization is you give people a bunch of emotions and you ask, how well do these characterize different groups? So your own group and the other group. And of course, you can see that some of these are positive and some of these are negative, but what the researchers are really interested in is that some of these are emotions that we share with animals, like anger, fear, and excitement. Others are more human-specific. So the prediction here is that you might endow another group with animal emotions, but you might reserve the human emotions more to your own group. So I've done this in Hungary, for example, and I get the predicted pattern. That is that people think that the primary emotions are equally typical of both Hungarians and the Roma minority population, but Hungarians reserve the secondary emotions more to themselves. The other common way to do this is implicitly, so to look at reaction time and people doing a task, and I'm going to do a little bit of audience participation here. So normally how you do this, this is normally a longer procedure, but I'll make it short here. So the idea is you have categories on the left, American names and human words, and categories on the right, Arab names and animal words. Normally, when a word comes up in the middle of the screen, you would press a key on the left side if it was American name or human word, and you would press the key on the right side if it was one of the categories on the right. What I'm going to have you do is just tap your leg. So tap your left leg if it's one of the categories on the left. Tap your right leg if it's one of the categories on the right. And the idea is to do this as quickly as possible. It's a reaction time task. So here we go. Okay, so far so good. Then for the implicit association task, so you would get a reaction time, an average reaction time. Maybe it's about a second for those. Then what you do is you just switch the categories on the bottom. So now it's just that American names and animal words are on the left, and Arab names and human words are on the right, but the task is the same, the words are the same. We're going to do it again. So get your hands ready again. Here we go. Okay, so what you should probably experience is that the second category pairing was much harder. You're more error prone and it takes longer. And this is indeed what we find. And importantly, it doesn't matter whether you start with this category pairing and then go to the other one or do it in this order. You still get the bias in this direction. So I've done this also with Hungarians. This was with Hungarian teachers, and their reaction time was about 25% slower when they were doing the task where the Hungarians were associated with animals and Roma with human. The other task was much easier for them with the Roma associated with animals. We can get an idea of how big this effect is. This is larger than any of the effects I've seen with Americans, for example, in politics. So we can see with these subtle measures that definitely Hungarians express these things, right? This is like everyday dehumanization. But the question is that blatant form of dehumanization, is it truly dead? And my feeling is no, that there's a little bit of a disconnect between the way that scientists are studying dehumanization and the way that members of disempowered groups are expressing feeling dehumanization. That to them, they're saying that they're feeling blatant dehumanization all the time. And indeed, I think we can see it if you look just a little bit. So here, for example, the group that seems to be okay to dehumanize right now is ISIS, sometimes Syrian refugees as well. So these are depictions of refugees and ISIS as rats and cancer, respectively. And if you step just a little bit outside of a country that has strong political correctness norms, you get quotes like this from Hungary, talking about the Roma. They are not fit to live among people. These Roma are animals, and they behave like animals. They are incapable of human communication. Inarticulate sounds pour out of their bestial skulls. These animals should not be allowed to exist in no way. That needs to be solved immediately and regardless of method. So this is not just an angry troll online in a comment section. This is actually the founder of Hungary's current ruling party. And this wasn't a hot mic moment. This was actually a published editorial. So these types of expressions seem to be reasonably commonplace. The question for me was how prevalent and how potent. So my goal here was to, the interesting thing was the assumption was so strong in the scientific community that blatant dehumanization wouldn't be copped to, that there was no measure out there. So I had to develop a measure. I had to validate it to see if it actually predicts behaviors, evaluate it in many different contexts, and then compare it to these subtle measures. So the measure I came up with is completely offensive and totally overt. It's just presenting people with the popular ascent of man diagram, presenting them with a bunch of groups underneath, and asking them to move a little slider to indicate how evolved and civilized they think each of these groups are. And here's the average responses for a group of Hungarians. If you convert this to a 100-point scale, there's a 29-point gap in how evolved and civilized they feel like Hungarians are relative to the Roma. And it matters. So this is Hungarian teachers who answer about the same amount of dehumanization. And here again, I'm just seeing how well do these predict their support for discrimination. So here are the 3 different dehumanization measures. And when I compare them to each other, blatant dehumanization is a very strong predictor, and the other 2 just don't predict at all. Right, so this, again, dehumanization is important to measure, but it's important to measure the right way. If we use the other measures, it doesn't really predict the behaviors we're interested in. And this isn't just a Hungarian phenomenon. This 29-point difference in Hungary is reflected by 26-point and 22-point differences in Greece and Spain, respectively. And it's not just the Roma. Of course, after the refugee crisis, I've been really interested in how Muslims are dehumanized in Europe, and they're comparable to the Roma. And it isn't just Eastern Europe or Southern Europe. It's also in all over the place in Northern Europe as well. Okay, so this is strong. It's predicting behavior. Here we can see that not only does blatant dehumanization predict, but it's complementary to this parochial empathy. So they are together predicting some of the behaviors. which is nice. They're not overlapping measures, but they're independent. And how consequential, so I've looked at this also in the American context. Indeed, in the US, there's some dehumanization going on as well. This isn't just a European phenomenon. We see these types of images. So this is a published cartoon depicting Iran as a sewer and Iranians as cockroaches scurrying down it. That was published a couple of years ago. And here's a quote from Mike Huckabee reflecting that kind of perception. And indeed, the average dehumanization of Iranians is 13 points in the US. And again, it's a really strong predictor of really important outcomes. So I did this survey right when the Iran nuclear accord was in the news, when it was trying to be decided upon. And I looked at people's opposition to the accord, their support for actually attacking Iran, and their willingness to actually sign petitions to that effect. And what I found was that blatant dehumanization is a strong predictor, here much stronger than even prejudice. And it supported all of these outcomes. And I think this is important because we know this is a politically divisive issue. But even controlling for people's conservatism, we still get a really strong prediction from blatant dehumanization. It was also true for war on poverty, so poverty-related issues, immigration-related issues, very similar. So blatant dehumanization seems to be really prevalent, it's really consequential, and it's much stronger than subtle or implicit measures. Okay, so I've now kind of taken you into the depths of despair. I've shown you that our intuitive evaluations are deeply problematic in some ways, that trust can lead to betrayal, that the type of empathy we may be measuring isn't necessarily the one that's driving conflict, and the same for dehumanization. As well, I've broken down a couple of intuitive interventions that often backfire. And along with this, since it's the elephant, it's always learning. So it can be learning negative associations with other groups, for example, seeing how Arabs are depicted in the media without, again, your consent. Okay, so here's the hope. So I think the hope first is that we can figure out measures that do capture these types of biases. So we can measure the right things, the things that are actually predicting behavior. That, to me, is very hopeful. And number two, there are really interesting ways that we can take advantage of these intuitive interventions, these processes that we know are going on in the brain, and actually use them to our advantage. So here's one. We can create informed interventions by intentionally driving norms. So this is what I showed you before. We have an intended effect. The unintended effect is the norm that drives the antisocial behavior. But if we just have this awareness that norms drive behavior, we can just change this so that the norm is driving our intended effect and get a pro-social behavior. This has been demonstrated really well with environmental behaviors. So for example, this one I think is really clever and subtle. This group of scientists hung door hangers on people's doors, right? And they hung one of 3 door hangers. Either this one, don't waste electricity, turn off your lights when you leave your house. This one, 99% of your neighbors think that turning off the lights to save energy is a good idea. And the last one, failing to turn off the lights when you leave the house is a terrible idea economically. Okay, so these are different intuitive appeals. Hopefully you can start spotting the norm here, right? So one of these includes a norm. It tells you that everybody else is doing it in the hopes that it'll drive that behavior. And these are the data. So these are actual data. They went to the people's meters and looked at how much energy they had actually consumed during that month from just having the door hanger on their door that one time. So think of how subtle that is. How many people will throw that away? And still, we get a measurable effect for the social norm, that it decreases people's actual energy usage over time. And we know that this actually has an effect. When we put people in the scanner and we do these tasks where we provide them with a norm, we tell them a bunch of other people like this, we can get changes in their actual neural response to foods. If we say a lot of people like this food, then when they taste the food, they actually get more of a response in their value region. If we say that this wine is actually really highly rated, then people actually get a higher response in their value region when they taste the wine. Same thing for attractive faces. A bunch of people found this person really attractive. When you see the face, you get more response here. I think that this could also be true for prejudice. So my hope is that we could actually drive a prejudice in the right direction by providing a norm for how unprejudiced other people are, your peers, for example. And another really hopeful informed intervention is educational inoculation. This is something that I've been really interested in lately. So again, I told you about stereotype threat, that this activates the amygdala and this decreases performance and IQ. I showed you this data. There was a really interesting intervention that people tried to decrease stereotype threat, and that is to teach people about stereotype threat. So just to give them a 5-minute presentation on what stereotype threat is, and then to say, okay, now we're giving you a test. It's diagnostic of your actual ability. And what they find is that if they just teach people about it, it completely eliminates the stereotype threat effect, right? So you can inoculate people against this effect, and I think what is happening is you are taking a process that's normally implicit, that's normally governed by the elephant, and you're pulling it into people's conscious awareness. And once it's there, now you can manipulate it. Now we have incredible control over it. And I think this is one of the most hopeful things about the human brain, this reality that the human brain is separated into elephant and rider, but it's also eminently flexible, that we can pull these processes that are normally implicit into conscious awareness and thereby change them. So I did this in an experiment recently. This was right after the attacks in Paris. The bias I was particularly interested in is this tendency to attribute individual outgroup actions to the group as a whole. So people see these attacks by a few Muslims in Paris, and they say Islam is a dangerous and violent religion, and Muslims are in general more violent. Right? This is a really dangerous process to go through, and we can see the potential consequences. Right? All of these were actual proposals by people in the immediate aftermath. And look at the types of things that they represent. Relaxed restrictions on civilian casualties when you're bombing ISIS. Right? What this results in is a bunch more innocent people getting killed who then might reciprocate against the people who were responsible for the damage. Temporarily close mosques, same thing. Right? So this is the type of behavior that results in a conflict spiral. So I was particularly interested in seeing if I could bring this type of bias to people's awareness and inoculate them against experiencing it. So what I did is I just had people online, Americans online, do this simple activity. I just presented them with a situation from the past. So Dylan Roof, this is the guy who went into the Episcopal Church and killed all the black parishioners. His white identity was a motivation for that attack. And then I just asked them, how responsible do you think you are for the attacks of Dylan Roof? And I had them actually respond. And then I asked them, how responsible do you think white Americans are for these acts? And then I repeated this. I did it for Anders Breivik, that Norwegian guy who shot all those kids at the camp, and the guy who attacked the Sikh temple. Again, people who kind of said that their white identity was their motivation. So of course, people respond very low on this. They say they're not responsible, white people aren't responsible. And then I just ask them, I say, okay, Muniba is a Muslim woman who lives in a small bakery in southern France. How responsible do you think she is for the attacks in Paris? And again, I do this a few times, and they respond about the same way, right? Less than 10 on a 100-point scale. And then I ask them to actually sign these petitions, right, that are actually circulating, to put their name to it. And the question was, does bringing people's awareness to this particular bias, does this decrease their willingness to sign the anti-Muslim petitions, and does it increase their willingness to sign the counter petitions? And indeed it did, right? It causes a measurable change in their willingness, their unwillingness to sign the petitions and their willingness to sign the counter petitions. Again, this was just a 1-minute activity they did online. But I think the reason here is that it's pulling this particular bias into their conscious awareness, and now they can decide what to do with it. Okay, so these are bits of hope here, and these are hope that comes kind of indirectly from our understanding of how the brain works. But I think there's also reason to believe that, that neuroscience can provide direct help to our understanding of conflict resolution. And this is the third part of hope, that neuroimaging might help both with informing interventions and with informing evaluations. So this is what I spend a lot of my time doing, sliding people into an MRI scanner and making them do really terribly uncomfortable things while they're in there and looking at what happens to their brain. I'm going to give you the penny tour of functional magnetic resonance imaging right here. So first, this relies on magnetism, right? The scanner is just a big magnet. And if you look down at the little demonstration in the bottom, this is just someone putting a compass into a loop of wire, and when they connect up the wire becomes an electromagnet. And you can see that because the compass needle aligns with the magnetic field, right? So this is what the scanner does. Think of the person in the scanner as a compass, right? There's a happy reality about the human body, which is that the brain is filled with blood. And it's not just randomly assigned to where it goes. Actually, all of your nerve cells in your brain have support cells. Each and every one has a support cell with its foot on a capillary. And it can dilate the capillary and bring more blood to that neuron, or constrict it and restrict blood flow there, so it can feed its neuron. Blood is traveling through there, red blood cells, and each red blood cell has over 2 million of these hemoglobin molecules, which just happen to have iron in them, which is exactly what a compass needle is made of. So in effect, your brain is filled with a bunch of tiny little compass needles. And they can line up in a magnetic field. And that's in fact what we do. All we do is put a very strong magnet outside, and it lines up these little molecules, these little iron molecules, just like compasses. What we can do then is imagine that compass is held in place. If you were to pull it over with your finger and let it go, it would snap back into place. Well, we do that not with our fingers, but with just a radio wave that's perfectly tuned, so it resonates with iron. And so if you look at the little diagram here, snaps back, and that gives a signal. And if I could focus this in one section, I could get a signal that could tell me how much iron is there and whether the iron is attached to blood. And that's what we do in neuroimaging. We just focus this signal to specific parts of the brain, and it gives us a readout of how much blood is there and how much oxygen is being consumed. So how hungry are the neurons in that region? And we just do that across the brain every 2 seconds. So we get a snapshot every 2 seconds of what the brain is consuming in all these different regions of the brain. That's it. That's neuroimaging. And what we get is things like this. We can say, okay, while people are viewing threatening images versus when they're viewing innocuous images, this part of the brain shows a stronger signal, and only this part of the brain. No other part shows a difference, but you get more blood flow here, more oxygenation here. And that's what the neuroimages that you see are generally talking about. So here's an example of how this can be used in intergroup studies. In this study, they just had people lying in the scanner, white people lying in the scanner, view pictures of white faces and black faces. And then they looked at what happens in the amygdala. Remember this region that responds to threat and fear. They looked what happened to it when either they showed these faces for 30 milliseconds. That's too fast for you to consciously recognize. If you see something that fast, you don't even report seeing anything. As opposed to 525 milliseconds, you can actually see that flicker on the screen. And they wanted to see what's happening in the amygdala when they show these faces, black faces and white faces, and they show them very fast, so you can't recognize them or not. And what you can see is the strongest signal in the amygdala, this threat center in the brain, is there when you see the picture for a flash, you aren't even consciously able to recognize it. So this is basically the elephant is giving you a strong response. If you get it for a little bit longer, you can inhibit that response a little bit, and you get a little bit less response. But you can see that there's a response to outgroup faces, to black faces versus white faces in this region. So this might be able to capture something that you can't consciously report. I've also looked at the dehumanization scale in the scanner. So I asked people to rate these groups, dehumanization or dislike. And I found here, again, there's a specific region that's responding to how much people dehumanize these groups. And if they are low status groups, Roma, Muslims, homeless, they're indistinguishable in this region from animals. So this region responds to these groups equally and responds much less to these higher status groups, like Americans and Europeans. And this is distinct from regions that are sensitive to dislike. So we see a completely different brain region for this. I've also looked at these higher level processes. So I had Arabs and Israelis in the scanner reading about each other's narratives about the conflict. So here's a pro-Israeli narrative that you hear often. Palestinians have wasted 60 years. In that amount of time, they could have developed a country next to Israel, but instead they chose terrorism. And here's a pro-Palestinian narrative that you hear very commonly, likening Israel to South Africa's apartheid regime. So Israelis and Palestinians respond very strongly to these. They wholeheartedly reject the opposite narrative. And what they were doing in the scanner is rating how irrational these statements were. And I found a single brain region that was much stronger when they were rating how irrational the statements were. So for Israelis, this showed up much more when they were reading the pro-Palestinian statements, and for Palestinians, the opposite. And there was one group, a small group of people, Israelis who were peace activists, who actually their neural response was identical to the Palestinians. So ideologically, they were aligned with Palestinians, but when I used other measures of bias, they were indistinguishable from Israelis. So the brain response seemed to capture that particular behavior. Okay, so neuroimaging might be able to capture some of these processes that we might be unable or unwilling to self-report, but it also might have a role in driving our interventions themselves. So one thing that would be really great to know is instead of running a bunch of interventions aimed at decreasing prejudice and then evaluating and seeing which one backfired and which one worked, it would be really nice if we could prospectively have a guess for which one might be most effective. And there's actually precedent for using the brain to do this. So this is the idea of a focus group. The problem is that focus groups are traditionally terrible at actually predicting what's going to work. Marketers have the biggest trouble with this, because if they ask a focus group which one of these will sell best, they never guess the right one, right? They guess at chance, because people can't, because the things that are driving people's purchasing behavior are often the elephant, and people can't self-report on that. So this is a really interesting study done by Emily Falk, who I'm working with right now. She had a bunch of smokers who had an intention to quit come into the lab, and she had them view a bunch of these different anti-smoking ads. So you know the ones like the little cartoon with the cigarettes who were trying to convince their humans to become addicted to them, and the dark comedies where the woman in a fit throws the cigarette out her second-story window, and then there's a 2-second pause and she jumps out the window after it. Or the one that just shows the black lungs and the person going through. So they're very different ads, and they asked these smokers, which one do you think will be most effective? And they answered the dark comedy, right? Clearly, dark comedy, that's going to be most effective. Then she had them all in the scanner view the same ads, and she looked at the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. She looked at where their elephant was actually valuing, and she found a completely different response. That is, the elephant was valuing the cartoon. And then she got New Jersey to agree to rotate through these ads, and they just calculated the call volume. So how many people called the 1-800-QUIT number that appeared at the bottom of all of these ads? And they found that the call volume was predicted by the brain, by the elephant, and not by the writer, not by the self-report. And I think that this process can be used for things like media interventions that we're trying to deploy to change people's minds. So this is my hope, that neuroimaging can indirectly inform our interventions and our evaluations, but also that it can directly add to our understanding of conflict resolution. And I've done this work with a really interesting group of people, Rebecca Sachs, Nir Jacobi, and Noor Kataili. Nir is Israeli, and Noor is Palestinian. So that's been a really kind of wonderful aspect of this research. And the funding sources have been equally diverse. As you can see, I don't know if there are many people who have done research that is funded both by DARPA and the UN and the Open Society Foundation. So with that, I'm happy to subject my brain to any questions you have.